They refused to see him as more than just a pilot. By the time they realized who he really was, he had already pulled the trigger on their downfall. Jordan Richardson stepped out of his car, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit. The parking lot of SkyLink Airways headquarters in St. Louis, Missouri, was nearly full, a sign of just how many executives were inside. Today's meeting wasn't supposed to be anything extraordinary, just another quarterly review, a chance for him and the other shareholders to discuss financials, expansion plans, and internal policies. But the moment he approached the front entrance, he felt it. It started the way it always did. The security guard at the main door glanced at him, then immediately looked past him, as if expecting someone else to follow. Jordan was used to that, being overlooked, underestimated. But what happened next was different. A young woman at the reception desk, early 20s at most, barely looked up from her phone before her eyes flicked over him. Her brows lifted slightly, as if she'd already made a decision about who he was. "Deliveries go around back," she said, turning back to her screen. Jordan's expression didn't change, but his grip on his briefcase tightened. He exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. He wasn't in the mood for this. "I'm not here for a delivery," he said, keeping his voice even. The receptionist gave him another once-over. This time, there was something almost smug in the way her lips curled. "Oh, well, maintenance requests are handled online." Jordan blinked. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He wasn't holding a package. He was dressed like every other executive walking through those doors. But she still saw something else. "I'm here for the shareholders' meeting," he clarified, his patience thinning. Something shifted in the room. The receptionist's smirk faded. A few employees standing nearby turned slightly, their conversations quieting. A man in a grey suit, a mid-level manager, Jordan guessed, stood near the elevators, his eyes flicking between Jordan and the receptionist. Curiosity laced with something else. The receptionist hesitated, then reached for the desk phone. "Let me just check on that." Jordan knew exactly what was about to happen. He had seen it before. When people couldn't reconcile their assumptions with reality, they stalled. They second-guessed. They looked for an escape. A middle-aged man in a SkyLink Airways blazer walked up at that moment, glancing between them. He was clearly one of the corporate types who had been at the company for years, someone who probably thought of himself as progressive, as the kind of guy who didn't have a biased bone in his body. "Everything okay here?" he asked, directing the question to the receptionist. She hesitated. "He says he's here for the shareholders' meeting." The man's brows lifted slightly as he turned to Jordan, taking in his appearance. "And you are?" Jordan met his gaze, his voice sharp and clear. "Jordan Richardson." The reaction was immediate. The color drained from the man's face. His lips parted slightly, and Jordan could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. The name meant something to him. Jordan had been with SkyLink for 20 years. He had flown some of the most complex routes, trained dozens of new pilots, and played a direct role in the airline's expansion. More than that, he had invested millions. His stake in the company was significant, not just symbolic. And yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. I apologize, Mr. Richardson," the man stammered. There must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Jordan's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm sure there was." The receptionist sat stiffly at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't look at him. The room remained tense, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. But Jordan didn't have time for dramatics. He stepped past them, heading toward the elevators, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. The conversation behind him resumed in hushed murmurs, but one thing was clear. They knew who he was now. But knowing his name wouldn't save them from what was coming. The elevator doors slid open on the 12th floor, and Jordan stepped into the executive wing of SkyLink Airways. The polished marble floors reflected the fluorescent lighting above, and the air carried the subtle hum of whispered conversations and clacking keyboards. A few heads turned as he walked past. Some faces held recognition, others discomfort. He knew exactly why. These hallways had seen him before, but only in limited roles. As a pilot, not an owner. As an employee, not an investor. He reached the glass-paneled conference room and pushed open the door without hesitation. Inside, 6 men and 3 women sat around a long, glossy table, murmuring amongst themselves. They were the kind of people who spoke in measured tones, who wore expensive suits but no name tags, the kind of people who didn't like surprises. A man at the head of the table, Douglas Fairchild, SkyLink's chief operating officer, was in the middle of a sentence when he noticed Jordan walking in. He faltered, his mouth half open, his blue eyes widening in barely concealed confusion. "Mr. Richardson," Douglas recovered quickly, clearing his throat. "We weren't expecting you." Jordan pulled out a chair and sat down, placing his briefcase on the table with deliberate ease. His fingers flipped the metal clasps open, but he didn't look away from the COO. "Why not?" Jordan asked, his voice smooth. A silence stretched across the table. Douglas shifted slightly, clasping his hands together. "Well, I mean, your attendance wasn't confirmed." Jordan cut him off. "I don't need to confirm. I own a substantial stake in this company. When decisions are made that affect my investment, I make it my business to be here." One of the women, a finance executive named Linda Greer, leaned forward, forcing a polite smile. "Of course, Mr. Richardson, we're happy to have you. We just assumed you were occupied with other duties, like flying your planes?" Jordan asked, arching a brow. An uncomfortable laugh rippled through the room. But he wasn't smiling. He let the silence sit, let the weight of it settle over them. He knew they weren't used to being called out directly, especially not by someone like him. Finally, Douglas exhaled and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "Well," he said, shifting topics, "since you're here, I suppose you'll want an update on our operational strategy moving forward." Jordan tilted his head. "I'd like an update on something else first." Douglas blinked. "Which is?" Jordan reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neatly stacked, stapled document. He slid it across the table toward Douglas. The COO hesitated before picking it up. As soon as he read the first line, his face stiffened. It was a detailed report. Not about finances, not about expansion, but about discrimination complaints, filed by employees, pilots, flight attendants, maintenance crew, all citing systemic bias at multiple levels of the company. Jordan watched as Douglas swallowed hard, flipping through the pages. The room, which had been filled with the rustling of papers and the occasional cough just moments ago, was now eerily silent. Finally, Douglas set the packet down, exhaling slowly. "This is quite the accusation." "It's not an accusation," Jordan corrected. "It's documented fact." One of the other executives, Mark Waller, the VP of Operations, scoffed. "Look, Jordan." He hesitated, then reworded. "Mr. Richardson, this is the airline business. We hire based on experience and skill. We don't have time for social grievances." Jordan's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So you're saying the dozens of complaints filed by your own employees, complaints you never addressed, are just grievances?" Mark hesitated. Jordan didn't give him time to recover. "Let me put it another way. If these complaints were from your son, your daughter, would they still be just grievances?" Mark didn't answer. Jordan let that hang in the air before straightening. "I suggest you take another look at that report. Because this isn't just an internal matter anymore." Douglas's forehead creased. "What do you mean?" Jordan tapped the table with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate. "I mean, I've been watching this company from the inside for years. I've seen how you promote, how you evaluate, how you dismiss, and I've had enough." The room tensed. Douglas exhaled sharply. "All right, Mr. Richardson. What exactly do you want?" Jordan's next words made the entire table stiffen. "What I want," he said, "is about to change the future of SkyLink Airways." But they had no idea just how deep the impact was about to be. The weight of Jordan's last words still hung in the air. The executives at the table exchanged glances, but no one spoke first. That was the thing about power. Most people in the room were only comfortable when they were the ones wielding it. Right now, Jordan was the one holding all the cards. Douglas Fairchild, the COO, was the first to shift in his seat. His fingers tapped lightly on the table, a nervous tick that betrayed his attempt at keeping a neutral face. "Mr. Richardson," he started, "we take these matters very seriously. If there have been any oversights in our hiring or promotion processes, we're more than willing to—" Jordan held up a hand. "Stop." Douglas froze. Oversights aren't the issue. An oversight is forgetting to include someone on an email. What I'm looking at is intentional neglect. The temperature in the room dropped a few degrees. Jordan turned to Linda Greer, the finance executive, and flipped to one of the pages in the report. Linda, tell me something. Why is it that, out of the 428 pilots currently employed by SkyLink Airways, fewer than 6% are black? Linda's lips pressed together. She glanced at Douglas as if searching for backup. Jordan continued before she could come up with a careful corporate response. And why is it that in the last 5 years, out of all internal promotions to captain, 0 were given to black pilots who had more flight hours than their white counterparts? A shift in the atmosphere. Eyes darted. A throat cleared. No one wanted to be the first to say what they were all thinking. Jordan leaned back. I'll tell you why. Because the culture you've built, whether you want to admit it or not, was never designed to be fair. Mark Waller, the VP of Operations, finally cracked. He let out a short, irritated laugh and shook his head. Jordan, Mr. Richardson, come on. These kinds of numbers exist everywhere. It's the industry. Jordan tilted his head slightly. Is it? Mark scoffed. Yes. Look, this is about qualifications, not race. We picked the best. If the best pilots are white, what do you want us to do? Lower our standards? A low hum of agreement passed through the table. Subtle. Quiet. But there. Jordan felt something sharp cut through his chest. He had heard variations of this argument his entire career. It was always dressed up in different words wrapped in corporate language coated in professionalism. But at its core, it was always the same excuse. Jordan nodded slowly. Interesting. He reached into his briefcase again, pulling out another stack of papers. This time, a different kind of report. He slid it down the table, right in front of Mark. I had a feeling someone would say that, he said smoothly. So I had an independent firm run a data comparison on your hiring trends over the last decade. Here's what they found. Mark frowned but picked up the document. His eyes scanned the first few pages. Then his posture shifted. Jordan watched as realization dawned. That's a breakdown of every single applicant to SkyLink Airways over the last 10 years. And what you'll see, Jordan continued, is that black applicants had higher average flight hours than white applicants who were hired over them. You'll also see that, on multiple occasions, experienced black pilots were passed over for promotion in favor of white pilots with fewer flight hours, more failed simulator tests, and weaker supervisor evaluations. Mark's throat bobbed. Jordan gave it a second to sink in before going for the final push. And just so we're clear, he said, voice like steel, this isn't just my conclusion. This was analyzed, independently, and if I can see it, you can bet your ass that an investigative journalist would see it too. So tell me, what do you think happens when this report gets out? Silence. Douglas swallowed hard, his hand flattened against the table. Jordan, listen. No, Jordan cut in. You listen. His voice was measured, but there was a sharpness to it now, a control he wasn't about to let slip. For years, I played by the rules. I kept quiet. I let things slide because I thought, maybe if I just prove myself, maybe if I just work twice as hard, things will change. He shook his head. But they didn't. Jordan placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. This report? He tapped the stack of papers. This is just the beginning. Because I'm done waiting for this company to fix itself. He let that hang in the air, watching as the reality of the situation sank into the room. But they still didn't realize just how bad things were about to get. The tension in the boardroom was suffocating. No one spoke. No one dared to look Jordan directly in the eye. The weight of cold, hard facts sat in front of them. And for once, there was no corporate jargon to hide behind. Douglas Fairchild shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching against the table. Look, Jordan. We recognize that these numbers aren't good. Jordan tilted his head. Not good? He let out a short breath. Douglas, these numbers don't just look bad. They are bad. And they're not just numbers. They're people. Qualified, experienced professionals who were overlooked because this company runs on the same old tired system that protects people like you. Douglas's lips pressed together. All right, he said slowly, carefully. Then tell us. What do you want? Jordan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his eyes roam across the faces at the table. These people, executives who held real power, had spent their entire careers making decisions that impacted lives without ever having to look those lives in the eye. Now they had no choice. Jordan straightened. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "I'm pulling my shares." A single second passed. Then, "What?" Linda Greer, the finance executive, sat up so fast her chair nearly slid back. "Jordan, wait." "No." His tone was sharp, unwavering. "You had your chance. I invested in this company because I believed in it. I put my money here because I thought we were building something better." He exhaled, shaking his head. "But all we did was build a house on a rotten foundation." Douglas's jaw tightened. "Let's not be rash." Jordan's expression darkened. "Rash?" He tapped the stack of reports in front of him. "Ignoring this for 10 years was rash. Treating pilots like me as disposable despite our experience was rash. Watching qualified professionals walk away because they were sick of proving themselves twice over was rash." He leaned forward. "I'm not being rash. I'm being strategic." Douglas opened his mouth to protest, but Jordan wasn't done. "I'm not just pulling my money. I'm taking this public." The air shifted. Everyone froze. Mark Waller, who had been silent for the last few minutes, visibly tensed. "Jordan, let's talk about this. There's no need to bring in the media." Jordan arched a brow. "Why not? You just said this isn't about race. You just said you hire the best. So what's the problem?" No one had an answer for that. Jordan continued. "Because the way I see it, if there's nothing to hide, you wouldn't care who saw this data." He tapped the stack of reports again. "But the fact that you don't want this getting out, that tells me everything I need to know." Douglas exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Jordan, listen. SkyLink is growing. We're expanding to new markets. We have a reputation to uphold. Do you know what happens if investors get spooked?" Jordan stared at him. "Oh, I know exactly what happens." The moment stretched. Then he said the words that made Douglas go pale. "I've already spoken to several key investors." Jordan's voice was steady, controlled, deadly. "Told them everything. Showed them the numbers. Some of them are just as disgusted as I am. Others, they don't care about morality, but they do care about bad press." Silence. Linda's face drained of color. "Jordan, when did you—" "This morning." A low, weighted pause settled in the room. Jordan could see it now. The way realization dawned on them all at once. The decision had already been made. Douglas's lips parted, but no words came out. His hand tightened into a fist on the table. Jordan studied him for a second. Then, with the ease of a man who had just won a game no one else knew they were playing, he stood up. "I suggest you start drafting statements now," he said, slipping his briefcase shut. "Because once this goes public, SkyLink will be in free fall." He turned toward the door. Douglas shot up from his seat. "Jordan, wait." Jordan paused. Douglas inhaled sharply, his jaw clenched. "There has to be another way." Jordan looked over his shoulder. "You had another way. You just chose not to take it." He walked out without another word, and what came next would be the beginning of SkyLink's downfall. By the time Jordan stepped out of SkyLink Airways headquarters, the wheels were already in motion. The first investor call came before he even reached his car. Thomas Klein, a major shareholder, had caught wind of the internal meeting and wanted to know if the rumors were true. Jordan didn't mince words. "They're true," he said plainly, standing in the parking lot with his phone pressed to his ear. "And I guarantee it's going to get worse." Klein was silent for a moment. "How much worse?" Jordan checked his watch. "Give it 48 hours." And he wasn't wrong. That night, a confidential leak hit multiple news outlets. An unnamed insider, though Jordan knew exactly who, had tipped off Bloomberg, Forbes, and CNN about the racial discrimination report inside SkyLink. The story was still developing, but the headlines spoke for themselves. Whistleblower exposes SkyLink Airways' history of bias in hiring and promotion practices. SkyLink Airways accused of systemic discrimination. Major shareholder pulls investment. CEO remains silent as SkyLink faces backlash. over alleged racial disparities in workforce. The stock market reacted immediately. By noon the next day, SkyLink shares had dropped 14%. A hit no one in the company had seen coming. Panic set in. Executives scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was too late. The story was already viral, flooding social media with pilots, flight attendants, and airline workers sharing their own experiences with the company. Then came the lawsuits. By the end of the week, 3 former employees had filed discrimination claims against SkyLink Airways, citing wrongful termination and career obstruction. Legal analysts were already predicting a class action suit, and Jordan was watching it all unfold exactly as he expected. But it was the press conference that sealed SkyLink's fate. The scene outside SkyLink's headquarters was a media frenzy. Reporters crowded behind steel barricades, cameras flashing as Douglas Fairchild, the COO, stepped up to the podium. His usual polished demeanor was cracked. He looked exhausted, the weight of the last few days clearly pressing down on him. Jordan stood at a distance, arms folded, watching. Douglas cleared his throat. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice tight. "I want to address the recent allegations regarding hiring practices at SkyLink Airways. Let me be clear. Our company does not and will never condone discrimination in any form." Jordan almost laughed. Douglas continued, reading off a carefully prepared statement. "We are conducting a thorough internal investigation and have engaged an independent review board to evaluate our practices. Translation: we got caught, and now we're scrambling. But what no one expected was the moment when a reporter cut him off. "Mr. Fairchild," a journalist from the Washington Post interjected, "are you aware that multiple SkyLink employees have already confirmed their experiences of discrimination on record? Some of them even claim they reported concerns to HR years ago and were ignored." "Are you calling them liars?" Douglas hesitated. That hesitation cost him everything. The media smelled blood. Reporters started shouting over each other, demanding answers. The press conference spiraled out of control in real time. Within hours, the clip of Douglas stammering, sweating, dodging questions was all over the internet. By morning, more sponsors had pulled out. By evening, several high-profile partnerships had severed ties. By the end of the second week, SkyLink had lost over 40% of its value in the stock market. The board of directors had no choice. Douglas was forced to resign. Other top executives followed. And just like that, SkyLink Airways was in freefall. Jordan stood in his office, watching the news coverage unfold. He had done what he came to do. He had exposed the truth. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about something much bigger. But the conversation that had started, that was far from over. The final blow to SkyLink Airways came on a Monday morning. A court filing confirmed that a class action lawsuit had been approved. Not just from former employees, but from passengers who claimed they had also faced discrimination while flying with the airline. Jordan sat at a cafe near Lambert International Airport, sipping his black coffee as his phone vibrated with another notification. The airline's stock had plummeted another 12% overnight. He had seen this kind of downfall before, but never so personally. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "I figured I'd find you here." Jordan looked up to see Lisa Beckett, an aviation journalist who had been following the case from the start. She set her bag down across from him and raised a brow. "You don't seem too surprised." Jordan smirked. "You always show up when there's a storm." Lisa shrugged. "What can I say? I chased the truth." She leaned in slightly. "Tell me something, though. Now that Fairchild is out, now that SkyLink is practically finished, do you feel like you've won?" Jordan exhaled slowly, rolling his coffee cup between his hands. This was never about winning. Lisa studied him. Then what was it about? Jordan leaned back. He had spent years watching talented pilots who earned their place, get pushed aside. He had spent years watching doors stay locked, no matter how much experience someone had. This was about breaking a cycle, he said finally. Lisa tilted her head. "And do you think you did?" Jordan thought about it. SkyLink would never recover. That much was certain. The name was too tarnished. Investors had already pulled out. Other airlines were rushing to distance themselves, putting out statements about commitment to diversity and equal opportunities. Things they should have been doing all along. Would it fix everything? No, but it had forced a conversation that couldn't be ignored anymore. He looked Lisa dead in the eye. "I think I made them listen." Lisa nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. She pulled out her notepad. "Well, if you have time, I'd love to get a final quote from you before I submit my piece." Jordan checked his watch. He had a flight to catch soon. But this was worth it. He leaned forward slightly. "Write this down." Lisa clicked her pen, waiting. Jordan's voice was steady. "Power only stays in the hands of a few if the rest of us let it." Lisa paused, then scribbled the words. When she looked up again, her expression had shifted. There was understanding there now. She closed her notepad. "That's a hell of a quote," Jordan smirked. "It's the truth." He stood, tossing a few bills onto the table before grabbing his briefcase. Lisa watched him for a second before calling after him. "So, what's next?" Jordan turned at the door. "I keep flying." And with that, he walked out. Because this was never just about one company. This was about change that would last long after he was gone. If this story made you think, if it made you question the way things are, then that's exactly the point. True change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we demand better. If you believe in that, subscribe for more stories that expose the truth. And remember, real power is knowing when to use your voice.